welcome again to Conversations with Communicators series, our kind of annual talks. Many of you, well, I bet the majority of you have been here for the whole day already, for the orientation program. But there are also probably newcomers. I mean, because the talk is after a public talk, so there might be people, coming over. And so let me introduce myself again. I'm Francis Lee. I'm currently the director of the School of Journalism and Communication at Chinese U of Hong Kong, and I'm also kind of, hosting the talk tonight. This evening we have the first Conversations with Communicators seminar for the academic year, for the new academic year. The Conversations with Communicators seminar is an annual series of talks that not just the School of Journalism and Communication, and actually more specifically, the graduate division of communication within the school, organized every year. The aim is, as the title, the general title of the talk series suggests, is to actually have conversations with very experienced professional communicators, in various communication industries. And tonight, we are very honored to have Mr. Carlos Tejada. Okay, sorry if I pronounce it badly. Okay, Mr. Carlos Tejada to visit us and to give a talk related to the New York Times. And just a little bit about Carlos. Mr. Tejada is the Asia business editor of the New York Times currently. He oversees a team of reporters who cover Japan, China, and other points east of Afghanistan and west of Hawaii. Okay, I find this line very interesting. So is it a technical, operational, formal definition of Asia adopted by the New York Times? I don't know, okay? And Carlos, by the way, has more than 2 decades of reporting and editing experiences, beginning his career at the Wall Street Journal in '95 as a reporting assistant in Dallas, Texas, and then he worked as a reporter and editor in Dallas and New York, and moved to Hong Kong first in 2008, and then moved to Beijing in 2011, staying in Beijing for about 5 years, and then coming back to Hong Kong. Well, by the way, the first time he came to Hong Kong in 2008, and in Beijing, he was with the Wall Street Journal, right? And after moving back to Hong Kong in 2016, he's now with the Times, with the New York Times. So again, thanks very much for joining us tonight, and also, hope you all would enjoy the talk. And so right now, without further ado, I would just invite Mr. Tejada to come out and to give the floor to him. So thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I can hear myself. Good evening, 大家好. You've had a long day today, right? And this is the end of it. So you're spending your Saturday evening with me. Aren't you lucky? As Francis described, I've been a journalist in Asia for about 10 years now. And when I entered the business, it was a vastly different business than it is now. And so I have a question for the news and reporting students in the room. Are you crazy? What are you doing in this business? Because I read the headlines just like you do, and according to the headlines, our business is dying. So print newspapers are disappearing, whether it's in the US, whether it's in China. One of the most entertaining things I've seen develop in China is the People's Daily, the Renmin Ribao, realizing that they were losing readers because their newspaper is so deathly dull. So launching its online version, which has given the world great stories like Kim Jong-un is the sexiest man alive. Everybody remember that story? That was wonderful. Newspapers are closing, journalism jobs are disappearing, and this is what the headlines say. UPR folks, by the way, lots of folks are here in public relations and some other fields. You're doing great, like no problem, right? There's now, at least in the US, more of you than there is of us. And that disparity is growing wider. You have more money, you have more resources, and most important, I don't recommend this, by the way. This is not a good idea. This will blow up in your face. But you could, in this current news environment, wherever you live, US, China, Europe, you name it, you can always, if you've got a story that you can't kill and your boss is shouting at you to discredit it somehow, you can always utter the term fake news. Number of people, that has currency. So, that concludes my talk. Thank you very much. Look, it's right there. No. So I don't actually. Well, I mean, it's true. Like a lot of these things are true, but there's a counter narrative as well. We are living in a golden age of journalism right now. More people are reading the New York Times than at any point in its history. More people are reading newspapers than at any point in their history. More people are reading news than at any point in world history. There is an insatiable hunger for news, and people are finding it. And we're also lucky enough to live in an era where we suddenly realize that facts matter, that truth matters. You know, what's happening with the New York Times right now is that we are suddenly getting attention, and we're suddenly getting business from people who realize that it's not just he said, she said, and it's not about spin, that there are verifiable facts in this world, verifiable truths, and it is worth something to go out there and find them, put them together in a cogent manner, and bring them to the people. So, 2 years ago, the Times decided that this environment presented a golden opportunity, that the death of print newspapers and the shift to online news was in fact an open door for us. This is an area where we could gain readers. You know, what is the New York Times? It's right there in the title, right? The New York Times. It's a city of about 8 million people on the northeast coast of the United States. And for many years, that's what that newspaper was. And several decades ago, the Times decided it was going to be a national newspaper. And it spent a lot of money, and it opened up bureaus around the United States. And it became the most important newspaper in the United States. So our goal now is to do that with the world. Two years ago, we decided to restructure our newsroom and actually spend money. We were going to spend $50 million to cover the world. And not in a, we're going to ensconce a bunch of editors in New York who are going to rewrite wire copy. And we're going to put people on the streets. We're going to put people in Beijing and Shanghai. We're going to put them in Islamabad. We're going to put them in Doha. We're going to put them in Johannesburg. We're going to put them in Moscow. We're going to put them all over the world. So when I joined the Times, I had a staff of about 3 people. I had a reporter in Japan, and I had a reporter who covered economics in Hong Kong, and a reporter who covered technology in Hong Kong. And that was it. Today, I have not 1, not 2, but 3 people who cover technology in Asia, which means China, right? I mean, the technology story in Asia is China. Japan had its time, right? The Walkman was nice, but the seismic shifts that are going on in China with regards to digital life that's a story we are not going to miss. So I now have 3 people covering technology. One in Beijing, one in Shanghai, and just an absolute kick-ass columnist, Li Yuan, here in Hong Kong. I have a reporter who covers economics in Shanghai. I have a reporter who covers technology in Shanghai. I have a person who covers perhaps the biggest story of all, the Chinese consumer in Beijing. And I work with a reporter in India who covers technology in India. He covers other things too, but what's going on there, I mean, some people think India is the next China when it comes to technology. We'll see. I have my doubts. We'll see about that. It certainly has its own unique trends and interesting things going on. And I'm hiring in Japan, if anybody knows anybody, for a position there. So this expansion is real. It's not lip service. We've spent the money. And so far it's working. And I want to talk a little bit about the things that we did to build out that global audience and to seize on this opportunity that we see to move beyond the 300 something million people who live in the United States and target an audience in the billions. So our goal in 2016 was we are going to spend $50 million and we are going to double our digital revenue from digital subscriptions by the year 2020. So far we're on the way. Last year our revenue from digital subscriptions rose by about a little less than 50%. So we have a lot of work to do, and the challenge is pretty enormous, but we're on track. We basically want to reach a people where the standard of news just isn't quite there, and we see Asia as a ripe opportunity. There are places in Asia where the media is aggressive and competitive. I mean, Taiwan is a great example. Even Hong Kong, which there's some pressures here, but there's still a pretty vibrant media scene. Japan, they're a little cozy with who they cover, but Japan, they're competitive. South Korea is all over the place. But after that, sources of reliable, verifiable news trail off pretty fast. The latest numbers from the journalism, from the journalism watchdogs are pretty alarming. Vast amounts of Asia live in places where there really isn't a free press, or the free press is under threat. And that's not just China. That's Malaysia and Indonesia. There's pressures in India. The Philippines is an absolute nightmare. People in the news business are losing their lives there, and that's pretty sobering. So let's talk about, for a second, excuse me for just a moment. I know I'm forgetting something here. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with journalism jobs. So the business of media has long relied on advertising, right? You put out a newspaper, you sell subscriptions, but the big revenue came from selling blocks of space in your newspaper to businesses that want to reach readers. We have lost that business. That business now goes to Facebook and Google. And we still have a decent advertising revenue, but the fact is that most people who read news now are not paying us. They're in effect paying those companies to read the news. And they're not producing the news. They're aggregating the news. Or they are disseminating the news, Facebook loves to swear up and down that they are not a media company, And so when you talk about holding Facebook accountable to media standards, they say, no, that's not what we do. We don't have reporters. We don't have editors. And now we see the consequences of that. Now even Facebook is acknowledging that they missed a pretty seismic shift in the way people consume news. That there were people who misuse and abuse the systems of social media and search and basically target the worst parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that are afraid of other people, of people who don't look like us, who are afraid that the world is a zero-sum game, and we're at the risk of losing everything. So they're working at it very slowly. They're working at fixing this problem. But in the meantime, we're going to go after those readers. So the New York Times had initially gone out and targeted trying to reach readers in their own languages. We've scaled back a bit on that, and we've shifted. Now we do have operations in 3 languages, right? We have in reverse order of importance, English, Spanish, and Chinese. Other publications like BuzzFeed and Vice, I believe, have lots of local language operations in Japanese and South Korean and Portuguese and lots of other languages that people speak around the world. We're after something a little different. What we want to do is we want to capture people who can read those languages, and then we want to draw them to become our customers. We follow the Wall Street Journal in adopting a paywall. You get 10 free articles a month, and there are ways around it. I'm not going to tell you, but you know what they are. But still, we're calculating that, especially in this day and age, you're going to reach your 10 free articles very, very quickly. And at that point, you're going to want to become a subscriber. And so our goal is to bring you in, but then keep you on our platforms. And we want to give you everything that you want to read about the subject. And we want to give it to you in ways that are easily, depends on how you consume the news. You want the 3,000, 3,500 word deep dive into a subject that took months to report. We got that. I've got a couple of those pieces on my desk right now that I have to move. Do you want to see it in pictures? Do you need to see the war in Syria? Do you need to see stepped up monitoring of the U.S. border with Mexico? Do you want to see environmental degradation in mainland China? We're going to bring that to you too with photos. Do you want to see it with video? Where we can do that too. We keep on shifting our strategy a little bit on video, but when we do it very well. I was just teasing Lockman earlier about Snapchat. I think we're both too old to understand it. At least I'm too old to understand it. But yet we're on Snapchat, or so I'm told. I wouldn't be able to find it if I tried. But we want to reach people of all ages, all around the world, who understand the value of journalism and are willing to pay for it, because we think it's worth paying for. When I left the Wall Street Journal and moved to the New York Times, I just, out of my own pocket, I subscribed to the Wall Street Journal. And given the environment that was going on, I subscribed to the Washington Post too. I kept on turning to the Post, which was very competitive in the time after the 2016 U.S. election. And I reached my 10-story limit on their paywall, usually in the first 3 days of the month. And when you do that, that tells you something, that you're drawing value from this platform. And if you want it to continue, if you want this information to come to you, that's worth something. There are student rates. You can afford it. Let's talk about some of the ways that we let's see. So our executive editor, my boss's boss, has said, just as the Times became a truly national news organization in a previous generation, we believe we now have the opportunity to become an indispensable leader in global news and opinions. So when I started at the Times, I've just described to you how I only had 3 reporters, and there are all kinds of stories we had to let go, to my intense frustration. I've made a long list. I'll just read off three of them. Is everybody familiar with the medical scandals with Baidu? Everybody here? Yes. Okay. So for those who don't know, Baidu got in trouble a couple of years ago in mainland China for basically allowing advertisers to dictate what people saw in their searches, the very first hit. And that's a problem in many, many areas, but it's an extreme problem when it comes to medical care. So what desperate people would go to Baidu to search for solutions to their illnesses, for life-threatening illnesses. And what they would find on Baidu was the very first hit would be, Dr. Joe has this amazing treatment. That is utter bullshit. And sometimes these treatments proved deadly. I think we did one story on it. I was not happy. I feel like we missed the rise of, we did a couple of stories, but we missed the rise of the Chinese consumer, which might be one of the most important, maybe the single most important economic driver in the world right now. Chinese consumers are buying cars, they're buying houses, they want, they're not content with simple meals anymore. They want more protein in their diet. They want clean air for their children. They want medical care for their parents. They want a good education, and not an expensive education, a good education. The intense frustration that I would get talking to young people in China when they realized that they would go to these universities and they would come out of it and they didn't have the skills that they felt they needed. This is an unstoppable force, and these people are going to try to get what they want, and the Communist Party is going to have to come to terms with that. They're going to have to deliver medical care, clean air, clean food, decent education to their people. And it's amazing what happened in China over the past 4 decades, coming up from basically an agrarian culture to the world's second largest economy, was pretty miraculous. But compared to the problems China has right now, that looks easy. We're back to covering this story. We weren't covering it initially, to my intense frustration. Other examples around. India went through a process where it decided it was going to stamp out corrupt money in its economy. So Prime Minister Modi decided to take money out of paper money, out of circulation, and force people from big companies to the smallest farmers to take their money and change it. This was intensely disruptive. A lot of people lost a lot of money. Some people lost their livelihoods. It set back the Indian economy. My colleagues on the foreign desk did a very able job covering it, but I was not able to cover it. Now I can cover these stories, and now I can bring this to the reader, because you as readers, not just journalism students, but you're all a lot more sophisticated than people were, when I was your age. The borders have fallen, and the internet has brought us all together, and we care more about places that people of my generation never heard of. I can tell you, judging by the comments I get in my inbox, how important the world and our readers feel about China. They can't get enough of our China coverage. In fact, our big problem is making sure that our readers can see our great Chinese coverage, because there is so much competition between various outlets and within our own organization for space on our website. One of the things that we struggle with constantly is the size of this thing, right? With a broadsheet newspaper, you could get 7 front page stories, a couple of great photos, and they're right there and everybody can see it. So then we go down to this computer screen, and you can pull up the New York Times' website here, but what's on top? Some pretty good stories, but we have basically, what do we have? 3 news stories on the top, a feature here, a tip line, got tips, please send them our way, a whole chunk devoted to our opinion page. This is kind of our struggle now. What I'm constantly going for is, how do I get real estate on the web page? And now, our web page is no longer actually a web page. This that you see up here is now the same underlying software that runs the mobile app. So it basically looks the same, except of course on the phone it's scrunched, and that just means fewer stories. That's a challenge we have to overcome. Part of that's part of our challenge. I'll get into this now. Is how do we draw the reader, and how do we keep the reader, and how do we keep them coming back? So the first stage of our expansion, and I have to admit, I don't know what the other stages are. I'm not that high up in the organization. But I can tell you that we have started off by targeting English-speaking countries. So we have staffed up initially in Canada and in Australia. And the Australian experiment is pretty interesting for us. But let's talk about the kinds of journalism that we can turn out. So this is a story about a man with an incurable disease who was exercising his right. I encourage you to look this story up, by the way. Basically exercising his legal right to die, to end his own life. And he decided that he was going to throw his own wake. So the day before he died, he threw a party for himself.
Today is the last day of my life. Hi, Ben, how are you? Good to see you. Oh, treat to treat.
One tradition of yours that we will have to keep alive is the winter solstice ceremony.
Oh, good, yeah.
Do you remember this?
Oh, do I ever? Oh, yes.
I didn't get the dress up memo, I'm sorry.
Well, here I am in my pajamas, so I can hardly complain. Do I look like a contented cow? A contented Greek fisherman?
We're befriending death. We're holding it. We're witnessing it. We're taking it back into our own hands.
This is a pretty amazing story if you get a chance to read it. or to look at the video, we need to find different ways of capturing an audience. And so sometimes the story isn't the way to do it, and sometimes it's a video. I did not. I wish I had worked on this project. I did not. But let's see if I can find it. Here it is. Nope. This is a story about murders in India, aided and abetted unintentionally, yet the company is aware of it, by WhatsApp. So WhatsApp in India has become a conduit to spread rumors and to spread fear. Oftentimes these rumors involve groups of Muslims who are supposedly coming into Hindu villages and kidnapping children. And what results are murders. We could have told the story, and originally we conceived this story as sort of a deep dive, traditional New York Timesian, 2,000 word narrative, the kind of story that people make fun of us for sometimes, the think piece, wither India, wither technology. We decided to do something different this time because other people had done the story. So how can we tell it in a way that you're going to remember? This is a story that moves, and this is a story that you don't read so much as you sort of take in and experience. You see this video? It's fake. And people die. When I asked earlier, what are you doing in this business? I'm assuming that those of you on the news side got into this business to put a stop to this kind of thing. Right? We get into this business because we see, we call them stories. Is that the right word for them? We see something that needs to be fixed, and we don't have the power to fix it ourselves, but we can write about it, or we can use new ways like this to bring it to you, so that you have to look at this man's face and you have to understand what's going on. Facebook has finally acknowledged the problem with WhatsApp. They still say they're not wholly to blame, and that's true, right? Facebook did not mount a big WhatsApp push in India with the slogan, "Let's go get a bunch of people killed," right? They didn't do that, right? This was unintentional. This is being misused and abused. But like so many other problems with Facebook, they are starting to realize that they bear some responsibility. Let's look at some of the other stories that we've been able to do. Thanks to our investment in Australia, where we're starting to gin up readers, we've taken a look at why in rural areas in Australia the suicide rate is so high. And you'd think, folks in Australia have it pretty good, right? It's a beautiful country. It's rich. The people are comfortable. There's certainly plenty of space. But there's a dark side to it. I'm not sure that the Times would have been able to do this story before our international expansion. But now we have talented reporters like Jackie Williams, who spent a lot of time and effort on this story to bring it to the world. You know, and we're immensely proud of that. You know, I think, you know, one struggle that we have is to bring to the world an understanding of what's really going on in China. You know, when I travel back to the States, you know, when I you know, I tell people, you know, I live in Beijing or Hong Kong. The first thing when I tell people I live in Hong Kong, the first thing many people ask is, so how do you like Japan? Yeah, no. But we do struggle, I think, to make people understand what's going on in China. People in the U.S. and around the world, really, they believe that China is either, number one, a fascist totalitarian state in which nobody can do anything, or number two, a super rich country that has already surpassed the United States and is already dancing on the American grave. Neither story is true. You know, Li Yan, who I used to work with at the Wall Street Journal, you know, she put it best to me, where I think, you know, people compare modern China to 1984, right? The classic dystopian novel of an overwhelming government destroying people's souls. And she says, you know, that's not quite right. I mean, it's certainly true if you're a dissident. It's certainly true if you want to challenge the government in any way. It's certainly true if you live in Xinjiang or Tibet. However, she says, modern China is much more like Brave New World. You know, the other classic dystopian novel, where people are in fact happy with the way things are because they've been made comfortable. And, you know, in Brave New World, they're given pills, the Soma, I believe it's called, to keep them happy. In China, they have the internet, right? In China, they have, you know, the netizens have an audience. They have short videos and streaming and e-commerce. They have Jingdong and Alibaba, and, you know, they have Taobao. They have so much more content than they ever had before, that they can stream at the touch of their, you know, with the touch of their phones. And almost everybody has a phone. I mean, anybody who can afford a phone already has a phone in China. You know, and that's something that I think we kind of struggle with. And one thing I really liked about this story, you know, we hired Lee as a columnist, so this is not a news story. This is from Lee's perspective. She is an expert in the Chinese internet and the way technology has transformed lives there. And she looks at because everybody knows about what's going on with Didi Chuxing. For those who don't know, Didi Chuxing is basically the Uber of China. And in fact, they're so good at it that they beat Uber in China and bought Uber in China and then promptly shut down Uber in China. And by the time the government said, hey, wait a second, you know, we got to check this to make sure this is like good for consumers. Like, no, we already did it. Sorry, you know, it's done. Uber's gone. There's just Didi. And Didi is in some ways considered a progressive company, right? Perhaps the most famous woman in technology in China is, oh my God, I'm blanking on her name, the president of the company. The woman who ran this Didi Hitch service, this carpooling service where anybody who's like riding home wants to make a little extra money, picking up somebody on the side, you know, she's a woman. They had a company video that compared her to Han Mulan, you know, the famous female warrior of old, immortalized by Disney. So how could this company run in name by women run ads like this? So this is a male driver picking up a female passenger. We cut out the copy because our readers, like, Chinese blows their minds. But it said originally it's a date. So Didi was selling this carpooling service, we just pick up a random ride, as a way to basically hook up. And now 2 women are dead, killed by hitch drivers, according to the police. I don't think they've been given trials yet. I think one's dead, so that trial's done. So Lee can bring this question to the world. How is China? She can tell the world, number one, that China has this vibrant technology scene and in some ways surpasses what people can do in the United States. My smartphone feels useless in the U.S. It certainly feels useless here. In China, I was awesome. Like, I could get anything done. I could get my bicycle tire fixed. Just pay with my, my Weixin wallet. It was great. Here in Hong Kong, I have to take cash money, and I have to go to the grocery store and put it down on the counter and pick up what I bought and take it home myself like a peasant. Not in China. And yet, somehow, there is this intense myopia in the Chinese technology scene that allows something like this to happen. We're going to talk a little bit, sort of at the end, about journalism in China, which is sort of one of my latest passions in life, something I discovered late in my life, and I'm really excited about. But after the first death involving Hitch, China's a tough place to be a reporter. China's a tough place to break news. China's a tough place to show social ills. But after that first death, people started looking. Southern Weekend started looking. Caixin, the magazine, started looking, and they started finding a pattern of rapes and sexual assaults and other incidents that had been traced to Didi drivers. And before that, nobody had really called them into account on it. Now Didi is facing a severe boycott. Now the company has to promise to overhaul its operations. They have admitted that they grew too fast and that they prize growth over everything else, including, it would appear, common sense. Chinese media helped bring this to light, and we're helping to bring that to the world. This is one of my favorite stories that I worked on with a reporter, Paul Mosier. When I say I worked on, like he did most of the work, I sit here and collect the glory. We've been watching all these rising reports about China becoming this place where everybody's monitored 24/7. Facial recognition is capturing the faces of everybody in China, instantly matching them with their IDs, and tracking everything everybody does. And like so much in China, there's a little bit of that's true, right? They do have increasingly sophisticated technology to track people. What we found out is a lot of it doesn't work very well, right? China's covered in cameras, right? You just go down the street of, whether it's Beijing or Zhengzhou or some nameless 4-tier city somewhere, when I'm giving these examples, I always think of Hefei, right? Like I once spent a week in the eastern suburbs of Hefei, which is far from my Beijing comfort zone. I went without coffee for a week. That was really hard. But everywhere you go, you see cameras. Are they watching what you do? Probably. Can they match your face to a national database of Chinese IDs? Probably not. Most of those cameras don't have the resolution to see faces, much less match them to a computer database. The computer databases are incomplete. The computer databases are often by province or by county or by city, and a lot of the automation, as it turns out, is really done by rooms filled with hundreds of people sifting through paper like it's always been done in China back in the days of the Danwei. So what Paul discovered was what's going on in China is, and when I first moved to China, how the government monitored the people was always something that they were very cagey about. They didn't like to talk about it. That is totally not true today. If you read the Chinese state-controlled media, it's filled with stories about how this criminal went to a concert in Qingdao and got caught by facial recognition, right? The heroin smuggler was caught by facial recognition. New high-tech technology. We can catch. The BBC did. I don't want to hate on the BBC. This is actually a pretty good video. It illustrated the point. The BBC sent they sent a reporter to what city was it? Anyway, they gave the police a picture of their reporter, and they said, "Can you find him?" And he went to a subway station, immediately got picked up. Now the reporter was like this tall and a white Brit. So yeah, he was easy to spot. But what we discovered is that the Chinese government wants people to think that a camera can spot your face and immediately connect you with a crime. It is an excellent way to keep people in line. Did technology catch you? Or are you just so afraid that technology is going to catch you that you don't break the rules? For the Chinese government, both are fine. Let's see. So, one way we try to reach readers, we'll talk about reader outreach. We use social media now more than we ever do before. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what our headlines are going to be to optimize them for search. What's the term at the front of the headline? I'm sure this is not news to young people. What's the term at the front of the headline that you can put out there to draw eyeballs? But we also try to find ways to capture the stories as they happen, right? Now, if you've dealt with, you spend any amount of time in the media business, and you start identifying certain trends that are true no matter where you work. And one is reporters are so busy and they have so many projects and so many deadlines that they don't want to sit down and write that quick daily story about what everybody's talking about right now, right? I know everybody's searching for this right now, but I have that big, think piece on Afghanistan that I have to turn in, right? You hear this from reporters all the time. So what the Times and now the Washington Post and others have done is they've created groups of reporters who do nothing but hop on the news of the moment, right? This was something that went viral very quickly, and we were lucky to catch on to it, right? A reporter just spotted that people were talking online about this lawsuit that hinged on the lack of an Oxford comma in a legal document. Does everybody know what the Oxford comma is? I hope everybody's taken, the news folks at least, I hope you've taken editing classes, right? So, you have a list of 3 things, right? A, B, and C, and you have a comma between B and the C. That's the Oxford comma. The news business famously does not use Oxford commas, but that actually can confuse things. So we were able to hop on this story and get hundreds of thousands of views and draw readers in, to give us a chance to keep them. This is a process that we've had to learn, just because people are talking about it online doesn't mean that we have to write about it. We still struggle with that, right? We spend a lot of time, I remember, people were talking about a snake in Indonesia that ate a guy, right? And so there's this video of the snake, and it's got a human being inside it, right? And you can see it's narrow, big bulge of a human being, narrow, like this. And there's video of cutting it open and getting the body out, and it's disgusting. But everybody's talking about it. Do we do the story? We decided that's one of those stories, just because people are talking about it doesn't mean we have to do it, right? That's a fine line. If we wanted views, if all we wanted to do was draw eyeballs, and that was the only goal we had, the New York Times would just run pornography all day, right? That, people will tune in for that. So we have to strike a balance between what's important, what furthers our mission, but what are people talking about? Let's not be snobs about this, right? People turn to the New York Times to find out what's going on. There was a lot of discussion about this story. This was, we call this group of reporters the express desk, right? And they hop on stories quickly. We will often say people are talking about this thing, Express is going to hop on it. Sometimes if it requires a knowledge of our region, we'll hop on the story. For example, there was a minor social media kerfluffle a while ago about a white girl, a high school student in the United States, who decided to wear a qipao to her prom, right? A cheongsam, the traditional Chinese dress, and some folks, some Asian Americans were upset about it, and I think somebody wrote, my culture is not your prom dress, right? So we wrote a story about it. Our angle on that was we didn't want to just write about the conflict, because basically it was a very small group of people who were offended that there was a white teenager wearing a qipao. So what we wrote about instead was the fact that people in China were puzzled by this debate. Like who cares? Like what? It was basically their take on it, and they were amused by the kerfluffle over it. This was an early attempt by the Express desk, and it was sort of a guide of like the kind of thing we don't want to do. And I think the story is fine. It's just it's just not much. There's just not much to it. Which is this is a woman on Instagram who was famous for smushing her face into bread. That's the end of the story. That's basically it. And so we had these conversations about, is this the kind of story we want to do? Probably not. This is not a kind of story, but this is the line that we sort of walk all the time. Like, how do we bring people like you into our portal without basically trivializing the news? We struggle. We all struggle. We'll get there. This is a story more recently that made it. Daredevil raccoon climbs up the skyscraper and becomes a sensation. Was this the biggest news of the day? I mean, actually, our newsroom was talking about it for quite a while. No, I mean, this story saved nobody's lives. It did not expose any injustices. It did not tell us something about the human condition. It did get a lot of views. And so, it got people into the site. Is this a story we could have skipped? Probably. But, it gave people what they wanted, and it's not tawdry or sad. Again, this is a line that we're still trying to figure out. I ask this question every day. Is this a story that we need to do? We need to strike a balance, I think, between the weighty stuff that we do and the stuff that people just like to forward to their friends and say, can you believe this? A raccoon climbed all the way up. All right. Another way that we're trying to engage with readers is we want to get a little bit about ourselves out there. So we, as part of our restructuring the newsroom to be digital, we did a bunch of reader surveys. Now, I was looking for this photo and I'm unable to find it, but one of the things we did was we took a photo of Tyler Hicks, who is one of who is basically the top of the game of photographers. He's an amazing war photographer, but he doesn't just shoot war. He's just an amazing news photographer. He's an amazing photographer, full stop. Pulitzer Prize winner. I've just never seen a bad photo from the guy. He's a treasure, and the Times is lucky to have him. So he's also let me see, get a picture of him here. There he is. He's also a very good-looking guy, right? So we showed a picture of our readers. Who is this guy? What do you think of this guy? And this picture is of Tyler Hicks wearing a jacket something like this over his traveling clothes. He's in Iraq, in a desert. He is walking on a dusty road, and behind him, some kind of oil installation is absolutely on fire, right? And he's smiling, his big kind of, white-toothed smile to the camera. And readers immediately looked at that and they said, oh, yeah, that guy, he's probably with Vice or BuzzFeed, because that's the kind of thing that they do. Like, they go out in the field and they go with cameras and they're like daredevils, and they go to these dangerous places where nobody else goes, and they do these like gonzo things. And I'm like, no, this he works for the New York Times. And this is what we do. our reporters in Pakistan, our reporters in Afghanistan, our reporters in Iraq, our reporters in Syria put their lives on the line like this, and our readers don't understand that. For years we thought that the way we could tell people where we were was the dateline, right? How often in my career have I typed Beijing dash, right, at the beginning of the story, telling the reader that we're in Beijing? Nope. Readers told us that they thought that we all stayed in an office in New York and let other people send us the facts, and we wrote up, and we stroked our beards. That's why we all have beards, right? So we sat and we stroke our beards and think about the news and write it that way. No, that's not what we do. So how do we communicate to people? And we're still working on this. But one thing that we do is we now do stories like that we call the Times Insider, where we tell people how we got the story, right? So actually I should have looked this up. After Paul Mosier wrote his story about how the Chinese surveillance state may not be everything it's cracked up to be, it's both ambitious and deeply flawed, he wrote a first-person piece about the facial recognition glasses that the cops in Zhengzhou let him try on. So there's a hilarious photo of him, putting on the glasses like this. And what he did was he put them on, and he looks at a crowd of people in the at the Gautier station, and they immediately they couldn't get away from him fast enough because they recognized these things were facial recognition glasses. But he noticed that they weren't really pinpointing anything, and he said, well, they're not. The glasses aren't capturing anything. And the cop said, they don't actually work that way. For them to work, you have to stand still. It's like, I have to stand still? No, the person you're looking at has to stand still. How long? It's like, and she goes and she talks with her coworkers and back. It's like 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it really depends. It's like, okay, so can you actually pick faces out of a crowd with these things? It's like, chabaduo, kind of. They're great for IDs, right? If someone gives you your Xinjiang, your ID card, you can look at, just hold it there like that, wait. Okay, got it, there. Okay, we got the image. Okay, now we're going to send that to headquarters, right? So that's the kind of thing that we want to do. We kind of, it's difficult because we're kind of taught early on not to put ourselves too much into the reporting. And I think what Vice and BuzzFeed and some of these other sort of pioneering, online-only media outlets were very good about was inserting their own personality into it. And readers really like that. We're told not to do that, right? We're told to be impartial, to step back a bit from the news, to be removed. And there's still a lot of value in that. So we have to kind of try to strike a balance. Do people really want to know how many phone calls I had to make to break that story? Probably not. But if it's something as interesting as the glasses, or another great piece was written by our Southeast Asia Bureau Chief, Hannah Beach, who has been covering the Rohingya, ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. She's heard many horrific stories, and then she heard one in particular that really galled her. And she started asking questions, and the person got a little kind of shifty about it, and she started checking it out, and as it turns out, the story wasn't true, right? And so a lot of this particular person had lied to her to basically get the sort of the word of what was going on in Myanmar out to the world. Now, the world is basically ignoring what's going on in Myanmar, which is frustrating. But at the same time, she wrote a piece that sort of illustrates the challenges of how do you get to the actual truth of the matter. We can't just go up to people and they tell us their story and we just kind of write it down and then we go out and put it out in deathless prose or on video. We gotta hunt down whether this stuff is true. That takes time. I think Hannah very skillfully showed how that process works and how sometimes, basically how our role of gatekeeper works. How am I doing on? Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up very quickly. I just want to talk very quickly. So I think a lot of you are from mainland China, right? And so I get a lot of questions like, how does all of this stuff apply to me? So I've been fortunate. Some of the best journalists I've worked with in my career have been mainland Chinese journalism students who have come to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and learned the craft and really excelled. And one way the Chinese government so effectively muzzles the foreign media is that, of course, they don't let Chinese nationals be reporters for foreign media. So we hire them as researchers, right? But the fact is, these folks are some of the most amazing reporters I've ever met. And I want to kind of wrap this up by simply saying that for those of you who might be frustrated by your inability to do the work that you might want to do in China, all I can tell you is that China needs you. If you're here, you speak English, and if you're from China, probably you speak Putonghua, Mandarin. That makes you a journalistic weapon of mass destruction. The world wants to know what's going on in China, and you are in a unique position to do that. Chinese people want to know what's going on in their own country, and you are in a unique position to do that. There's still enterprising reporting done all the time. Caixin, Southern Weekend, even I have a former colleague who went to work for the Global Times, and we said, like, I don't know what she's doing. She's never going to be able to really report well. And then a couple months later, she had a terrific story about corruption within the Beijing emergency services, ambulance, helicopters. Do you need help? Good luck. And yet these people are taking a lot of money from the city. It was a terrific story. So what I would tell you is, you're needed, and go get them. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Carlos, for the very interesting, inspiring talk. Because of time constraint, I would try to leave as much time as possible to the audience to raise questions. But just let me ask the first question. Not because I have the best question to ask, just allow a few minutes to for the audience to get prepared. Once the first question ends, I would like to pass the microphone to the audience. So a large part of what you have been talking about really involve to go back to the beginning of what you talk about, the increase in readership of the New York Times or of a lot of major international media, which also implies a change in the audience, right? Which also implies actually a change in, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, traditionally we talk in terms of foreign correspondence. Right now, from what I understand and also from what I hear from you is the idea is no longer just foreign correspondent. It's not like an American going to China or going to Hong Kong, going to Asia, and then reporting it again, and reporting it back to the American audience, right? You are actually reporting that to the Asian audience, to the global audience. So my first question is a very simple one. It's just also kind of a personal one. So just your personal experience, does that transformation have any kind of, lead to any kind of, say, a change in perspective in how you work in this part of the world? Challenges, tensions, etc. When you started, originally it's really reporting back to America. Right now it's really, talking to more directly to the Asian audience.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with little things like, do we write about miles or do we write about kilometers, right? Americans use miles, and nobody else does, really. I think Aussies do. when we talk about the season, autumn, is it the fall? In Australia, the leaves don't fall in autumn, right? So it starts with the little things, right? You look at an audience and who you're writing for, and realistically, we always, we can't write about Asia in a way where we can skip all the steps that like folks in Asia would understand, but people in the U.S. would not. We've got to spell it out for the U.S. audience too, right? Yeah. But there we what we try to find is the most kind of global way to tell the story, right? So, I try not, me personally, I try not to think of, I had an editor who was like, how would you explain this story to a guy in a bar in Iowa, right? I don't think that anymore. That's not just our audience anymore. I don't have a good answer for you. It's in the little stuff, and it's in the framing of the stories. It's something I sort of struggle with all the time myself. But it's a constant challenge to find a way to speak to a global audience, and we can't. A reader in India is going to have different questions, I think, than a reader in the UK, a reader in the US, and a reader in Brazil. So we just have to write it in the most broad way possible. It's not a very good answer, but that's all I got.
Okay. Actually, I do have other questions, but I guess as I said, it's better to open the floor at this moment. So we would welcome any questions. Our staff Tony would help pass the microphone. So if you have any questions, please just raise your hand, and then we will pass the microphone to here, Dimitri.
Hi. Well, you mentioned that you had an interesting approach, or at least a varied approach to video content creation. Recently, there has been a lot of talk about the so-called video pivot, and with a lot of publishing houses, even like online publishing houses like BuzzFeed or AJ Plus, really switching to video because it seems to be seems like a more engaging sort of medium for online news consumption, especially in this smartphone generation. Do you feel like that is a thing that applies to the New York Times?
Well, absolutely, with a big caveat. So one of the first questions we now ask is, what's the best way to tell the story? Is this a traditional news story? That's what I grew up with, right? That's what I know how to do. I can't shoot anything, right? I'm a terrible photographer. I just don't think that way, and so I have to sort of force myself to ask, what's the best way of telling a story? Do we do a traditional story? Do we do just blocks of text? Do we do this with a big, informative graphic? I have done so many trade graphics, by the way. Trade numbers, I got them. Or a video. Is the best way to do this story a video? Oftentimes, it is the best way to do the story. However, it really depends on the story. Healthcare reform in the U.S. is almost impossible to tell via video, right? The Chinese economy is a story that's very difficult to tell via video. I mean, the problem is we cover so many complex subjects. I think very famously, a couple of decades ago, there was a TV anchor in the U.S. named Dan Rather, who told his TV audience, we can't explain this story to you on television. You should, to learn more about this, you should go read a newspaper. So that's the thing. The difference is, I think, Vice and BuzzFeed covers more stories that are going to be told in that way. We definitely ask the question, is this a story that's best covered in video? And I think sometimes we still default to writing. In some ways, writing is easy. You can write anything in an afternoon, right? But too many of the subjects that we deal with just aren't right for that format.
Carlos, first, thank you for your time and sharing, despite it's Saturday and the unwelcoming weather, as we know, so I appreciate that. And so the question is about the, ongoing the trade war. So I want to know your view, first of all, because of the 200 billion tariffs next week, after the public comment ends on September 6th, if I remember correctly. So there will be something, hopefully.
That's right. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And then, so as you've mentioned about the China market, technology, consumer, etc. But actually, I'm sure you're aware of that. Actually, the stocks have been down. Even Tencent missed the first quarter result for the first time ever, while the U.S. market is just going up and up and up. With the Apple makes the first world's $1 trillion company. So, because of your experience, especially you have experience in China and Asia, so I want to know two questions actually. The first one is, what's your personal view on this about the ongoing trade war? Like, no need to specify like who's gonna be the winner or loser, because apparently as long as it's a war, there is no winner. So, and the second question is about like, I'm sorry, I haven't been following about the reports from the media. I mean, from the New York Times. So how are you planning to cover the story? And yeah, have you got any plans? So one is personal, the second one is like from your media.
Sure.
Thank you.
Let me tackle the second question first, which is one of the biggest challenges that we face is a story that goes on and on and on. There is a temptation to kind of throw your hands up and say, we've already written that, right? In the trade story, we've done a lot of trade stories. And you know what? The trade war is not going away. People who thought the trade war was going away have been wrong. People thought that Donald Trump was not going to levy all these tariffs on China, and he has. And even now, just last week, I talked to somebody. He's like, "Well, I'm not sure he's going to carry out the $200 billion in tariff. The tariffs on $200 billion in goods." It's like, well, we said that with the $50 billion, right? We said that with the steel tariffs. We said that with the solar tariffs. They all came into effect, right? I can't predict what's going to happen, but if past pattern holds, we're going to get those new tariffs too. So we have the same problem covering North Korea. How do you say kind of the same thing over and over again, or how do you keep from saying the same thing over and over again to keep readers coming back and to enlighten them? You can get lazy. All I can tell you is that we're constantly asking questions and constantly looking at ways to doing a story that we haven't done before. Sometimes we'll see a paragraph in one of our stories and we'll say, can we, this was in a previous story, but can we illuminate this? Is this something that we can do a graphic, right? And so we, for example, we had at one point, we were inserting these graphs and stories about, here's how the tariffs came down. And then we said, well, what if we just kind of broke it out and listed it in sort of a timeline? And then somebody got the smart idea of, why don't we put it together in this like constantly moving graphic about what it looks like? So in talking about like different story formats, that's one of the ways thinking in different formats is a huge benefit, right? In some ways, the dynamics of the story haven't changed, the underpinnings haven't changed, but we're finding new and different ways to tell those stories through graphics, through videos. And that's a big change from when the only weapon in our arsenal was a long story. Personal opinion. This was probably long in coming. I think Donald Trump has started something that I think will probably, again, this is my opinion, worth nothing, but probably started something that's not going to stop. He could very easily be, his power could be checked in the next election in November, and in November 2020, his popularity ratings are still not that great, he could be out of office. But I don't think the trade war is I'm not sure that the American people clamor for a set of leaders who immediately make peace in China. Tremendous amount of frustration in the U.S., both with business executives and workers in certain industries on the ground, that they've got the wrong end of the deal in China. Now, I think that China's rise is a massively economically beneficial development for basically everybody in the world, right? American companies made a lot of money off it. American workers are making products for Chinese consumers, right? Without the boom, you wouldn't have Apple designing phones that Chinese workers are making that go back to the U.S. and then increasingly really are sold in China too. China is now Apple's second biggest market. That is, the facts bear this out, like the numbers bear this out. That's undeniable. But I think it's also true that for the longest time, there are certain very specific groups of people in the U.S. and in other countries as well that kind of got the wrong end of the stick on this. The economic transformation hurt them more than it helped kind of the larger group. And I don't think those voices are going away, and I think it's going to continue. And I think the Chinese government hasn't quite figured out how to stop this yet. And I'm not sure they're going to be able to. And I think we may be in kind of a new period of U.S.-Chinese economic relations where trade barriers are simply going to become the norm.
Here.
Thank you, Mister, for your talk. And I have a question about, you have mentioned in the end that that China have become a good place for journalists because it can be like a bridge between.
It's a pretty terrible place for journalists, but
okay.
Please continue.
But you mentioned that it has some potentials in
Yes.
some ways, right? So you mean like journalists can become a bridge between the world and China? But I have a question that since journalists can be a dangerous like occupation, right? Since like we know like the freedom of press in China is limited, like very limited. So I wonder like what is the extent of the news outlets in China that journalists can express? For example, can they dig out some scandals that the Chinese government want to cover, or just really just directly convey the messages that the government officially announced?
That's a good question because the Chinese government, the Communist Party to me does a very impressive job of trying to gauge public sentiment. Polling is highly restricted in China unless you're the Communist Party, and they pull the shit out of this place, right? They are constantly monitoring people's attitudes, what people are saying. It surprised a lot of us when they cracked down on Weibo a few years ago because Weibo itself had become this like way of transmitting what Chinese people were talking about that day, that week. But it got too raucous, and so they shut it down. And so I kind of wonder if that's changing. But you still see times when the government realizes that something is spiraling out of control, and they're going to let the media go with it. Actually, what's going on with Didi Chuxing right now is actually a pretty good example because the company's back is against the wall right now, and this could change tomorrow. But as far as I know now, there've been no orders, from any of the propaganda like officials saying to like cut back, right? And that's always the tricky thing. There was this Under the Dome documentary a few years ago that got everybody in China talking until the authorities said, no, don't talk about it anymore. The magazine Caixin had a spectacular investigative piece about the Chinese businessman Ye Jianming, who everybody thought must have some kind of ties to Xi Jinping. I mean, because how is this guy like doing these incredible deals? He just bought a chunk of Russia's largest oil company. I mean, buying a Russian oil company, he's got to have some kind of connections, right? But Caixin did a masterful story, like looking at the underpinnings of the business and how much debt and how much trouble it was. Maybe this guy wasn't so connected after all. It went out, got pulled down in a matter of hours. But it did get out. And people read it and people talked about it, because I actually asked my Chinese friends, like, are you talking about did you see the story? It's like, yeah, everybody's talking about Ye Jianming, right? So I think things are getting worse in China in that they're less and less likely to let things ride, but you can still see it. You can still see the power of the press in China before the authorities move to contain it. And I can also just, from talking to Chinese people, like their absolute appetite for information and news is just insatiable. This is one reason that Toutiao exists, and one reason that Toutiao is now in big trouble. They got a little too close to the sun on this. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing just now. So you've talked a lot about reporting in China and how the New York Times has been changing its engagement with areas outside America, let's say in China or India. But what about Hong Kong? Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about maybe any future directions of the NYT's involvement in Hong Kong and your views on Hong Kong and its place in international journalism? Thank you.
Oh, tough one. Part of the problem with Hong Kong is there's only 7 million people in Hong Kong, right? So, as much as I love the place and love living here, it's not a tremendous market, and people don't wake up in the morning all around the world wondering what's happening in Hong Kong, right? That said, Hong Kong is a fascinating story for us because in some ways it's the China story in a digestible microcosm, right? So all the current and former city officials are now getting on the case of the Foreign Correspondents Club, right? Because Andy, I was out of the country when this happened. Andy Chan was his name. Andy Chan spoke the Independence Party, and now there's some, there's lots of people, there's lots of politicians in Hong Kong saying, nice luck you got there. Should we be ashamed if something happened to you? Right? Which is how things work in China, right? Sometimes you don't necessarily just throw somebody in prison. You threaten their livelihood. You threaten their families. In a very small way, that's what's going on here. So you've got these city officials who are enthralled, with Beijing. Their power stems from Beijing, and they're starting to threaten the FCC in a way that I think is at least counter to the spirit of the Basic Law, and counter to Hong Kong's tradition of a free and open media. When you see the papers that are sort of tilt toward Beijing's side, ginning up very pro-Beijing arguments about why the FCC should be in big trouble, that's a little bit about how things work in mainland China too. So in a way, I like to look at the Hong Kong story as like, this is in some ways, how you become mainland China. That process is fascinating, and it's a way to tell. So it's a way of, looking at the news in Hong Kong and kind of telling a broader story. Here's what's going on in China, or here's how to understand what's going on in China.
Now, okay, because of time constraint, let me ask, maybe we can try to have a last round of questions. So instead of one person asking a question and the answer, may I put together like the last round of maybe 2 or 3 questions? So I see the gentleman there, and then gentleman in the pink shirt, right? And who else? Any? Okay, and the lady. Okay, so we have the last round of 3 questions, and we'll actually ask the order. Okay, Lockman. Okay, I allow you. Okay, the fourth question. Okay, so we have last round of all the 4 questions. All the questions will ask the questions first, and then Carlos can answer that in one go.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for your insightful presentation. especially the challenges facing journalists. I have worked as a journalist for 3 years in my country, and Ghana. Yes, and I will encourage colleagues here that it has its challenges, and but it's also an exciting job. And those who wish and love to go into it, like you have stated earlier, should take up that opportunity. Now, quickly to my question, China is raising some concerns that the Western press reports badly about China. Okay, it has been literature, in most of their conversations, in most of interviews people have with them, these trends do come out. One aspect of it is ideological, right? The West versus China, issues of democracy. China will say we are running democracy with our own characteristics, and the media is more or less pushing that most of the time, right? Now, we have also mentioned something about the economy, like they are the two most powerful economies in the world, and the rise or the quest for dominance or supremacy is high among these two countries, right? So China raises that concern that one of the problems that people have about them regarding journalists is that Western journalists report more or less negatively about them. So as an editor who has been here for a while, do you share that view that they are sometimes negatively reported about by the West or by the Western press? Yeah.
And we have a question. Jimmy.
Hi, firstly, thank you for the nice presentation. And my question is from the perspective of a newly admitted students in journalism. Because you were just talking about like the reporters nowadays, some of them are not willing to just sit down and writing about the things people are talking today, and just because they are like doing some good stories in Afghanistan. Because I used to work as an intern in the New York Times travel magazine. It's a magazine that founded in China, but collab with the New York Times, so that we can use we have the copyright of the articles, the photos in the travel section in New York magazines. And the thing is, because it's a newly founded magazine, so we don't have like many readers. So when we do articles like 20 tips to travel on a budget, or like to find cheaper hotels, we got a lot of hits. But like when we do those stories, I think it's good. It's like the situation on the broad between Mexico and America. Like this kind of stories, we don't have like many readers who read that. So I'm just wonder like how should we, like as a student, how should we like balance the situation? To write between those clickbait stories only to attracting views, or should we take much more time to doing those those so-called good stories? Because as my from my experience working there, like you have to do those clickbait so that you can have the readers foundation, the money to do the good story. So that's my question. Thank you.
Hi. Just a question. In my role as an academic advisor to many of the reporter students here, journalism students here, so I advise many of them and I teach many of them. And if they come to me and they say, hey, I want an internship at the New York Times, or hey, I might even want to work at the New York Times. I'm going to study here for a year, and then after that, I really want to, see if I can end up there. What advice should I give them?
Okay.
What can they do?
And then the final question from the...
Okay. First, thank you, sir. Thank you for your wonderful speech tonight. My question is very simple. In your opinion, which one is more important? The news itself, the story itself, or the way we write or promote the stories? That's it.
Whew. Leave me off with a killer.
Okay.
Sorry, just a second. Is it possible to get this computer screen up again? Okay. Whoops. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Ideology question first. There is a risk of looking at U.S. versus China as a zero-sum game, and I think that's something that I'm constantly watching out for. Number one, the world is a lot more complicated than that. The economy is a lot more complicated than that, and I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that it doesn't devolve into a story that's just it's China versus the U.S. and that's it. In terms of focusing just on politics, one of the things that we try to do, I try to do as a journalist is try to focus on the other things that are going on in China as well. We have an intense interest in the medical system in China. That's not a the U.S. is better, oh, China has problems kind of story. This is a really important story, and it has nothing to do with China's winning or China's losing, right? Those are the kinds of stories we want to do. We also want to do the very kind of human interest stories. We just did one about China's fascination with technology and how it's resulted in things like robot cafes, which don't actually work very well. Like the robots don't deliver food very well. They can't deliver soup. It spills soup on people and it burns them. Sometimes the robots stop working. You got to flip them over and get a screwdriver going to get the gears. These are just fun and interesting stories. And what I want to do is kind of tell, this is how it's fun and interesting in China, or this is just what's unusual in China. You're right. I mean, I think there is a risk of making this just too much of an ideology thing. I fight that, and I know my colleagues do too. The Chinese government wouldn't agree with us, but they only complain. They never say nice things. Sorry, clickbait question. Yes, okay. I would say that is a problem of distribution, right? It is incumbent on us at the New York Times to find a way to get our best journalism in front of the reader. The solution is not to stop doing the interesting stories. If the solution is not stop covering Afghanistan. So yes, the 10 best hotels, the 10 cheapest hotels for your trip to Mexico. Yeah, lots of people are going to click on that, right? And they're not going to click on, the bombing in Afghanistan. We cover the bombing in Afghanistan because that is our job. That is what people go to the New York Times to do. And if we do nothing but clickbait, we are no longer the New York Times. And somebody else is going to come in and take our position from us. So we've got to hold on to that. So, we don't want to be too ideological about it. I've given some examples of stories that we do simply because they're interesting. They're not galactically important. But it's on us to find ways to get that to our readers, to make sure we are advertising our best possible copy. We're still working on that. I don't have an answer for that. We've had amazing success with, believe it or not, newsletters and emails. The Daily, our podcast, is an enormous success and has driven more traffic back to our publication. It's very kind of Washington and U.S. focused. They do occasional kind of U.S. foreign stories. We're constantly trying to ways how can we get on that train, But we're slowly getting there. We're still working on that. But it's the wrong question as an either or. The question is figure out how to get it in front of our readers, come up with a brilliant answer, then come work for us. Okay. I'm sorry. We don't take first time. If you don't have clips, we're not going to take you. We cannot be your first internship. we've got to know you've got some experience. That said, we have Hong Kong people working in our office. We've had Hong Kong interns. We love them, and we'll put them to work. So the answer is to tell Lockman and to reach out to me. And I'm very busy. You may have to remind me, but I will try to take a look and say, maybe you've got a shot, maybe you still need some work. I'm sorry if I've forgotten the last question.
Whether the news event itself is the more important thing, or how journalists tell the stories, write about it, talk about it. I mean, the kind of product.
Oh God, it's all important now. If you're not right away on the event, you miss the traffic, right? If a big event happens and you're 6 or 8 hours late, the way the search algorithms work, like you're done. And then you've got to keep updating the story, or you're done. We have these situations where, we had this amazing interview with Elon Musk at Tesla, right? Where he's talking about, tweeting while taking Ambien late at night and all the pressures he's under. As his board is complaining, taking the company private. Like, it was an amazing interview. And it immediately shot way up high into traffic. And then immediately started dropping as other people did stories based on our story. What the heck? Right? And so what we then had to do is we had to start going out and do sidebars and follow up to keep it going. So the answer is like they're both important. Got to be on news. You got to get it out there, or you're behind and you're missing readers. And then you've got to do the big story that people are actually going to talk about, right? That's the real kind of trick, right? Is you want to be quick, and then you want to be interesting, right? There are other media publications that will simply do a whole slew of 17 stories on the event as a way to traffic. What we want to do is we want to get the story. We want to find ways to keep our story relevant, and then we want to do the big step back and say, okay, here's what really matters. So it's both, really. And by the way, our coverage of Elon Musk and our coverage of, I'm going to point out our coverage of Harvey Weinstein, like just to end this idea that journalism is in its death throes, that journalism is in trouble. Ronan Farrow of the New Yorker and my colleagues at the New York Times changed the world with their coverage of Harvey Weinstein and bringing, helped bring the Me Too movement to where it is. I mean, even in China, people were talking about it, right? I mean, that's impact. That's what we do. And I hope that's what you get into the news business to do too.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. Thanks for the great, inspiring talk. I think, also thanks for the questions. And I think at the end, we do have a souvenir.